The question is not what is Agenda 21? The question should be what isn't Agenda 21? And it's not Republican, it's not Democratic, it's not Libertarian, and it's not Independent. It's Communitarian. That's the new law of the land. What is Communitarianism? Well, few Americans will ever have been taught the original Communitarian law, derivative Communitarian law, or complementary Communitarian law, even in higher education. Most schools introduce their students to international law and leave it at that. Communitarianism is now the new surrogate individual. Well, what does that actually mean? Before we get into that, stay up to date with everything Iconic by following us on all of our social media. Don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to our channel. To support us, you can go to patreon.com/theiconicpodcast and make a monthly pledge. You can also go to theiconiclabel.com and purchase a hat, a hoodie, or some gear. Now let's get back to it. Well, what does it mean? What is communitarianism as a surrogate individual? Well, since the long arms of Agenda 21 are reaching into every area of the world, the philosophy of communitarianism is being passed along with it. People are slowly, quietly, passively being pushed into what's known as the hive mind, the collective mind, or consensus thinking, mass formation psychosis, or groupthink, or whatever term you like to use to describe it. Individual rights and freedoms in general are to give way to the needs of the communities, as described by the globalist governing body. The United Nations Agenda 21 calls for lowering the standards of living for Americans so that the people in poorer countries will have more. That's called a redistribution of wealth. Only then will there be social justice, which is a cornerstone of Agenda 21. The lines between governmental and non-governmental groups will be blurred more and more as unelected local groups make policy decisions using what's known as the Delphi technique to manufacture consensus. What is this Delphi technique? Well, developed by the Rand Corporation as a Cold War mind control technique used to channel a group of people to accept a point of view that is imposed on them while at the same time convincing them that it was their idea. Well, what are they using this technique to make you think it was your idea? That your individual rights and freedoms need to be balanced against the collective rights of the whole, that your freedoms need to be limited for the common good. The same goes for your nation's sovereignty. Nations and their populations have acted irresponsibly and have almost irrevocably damaged the world's ecosystems. But thankfully, we can all come together and balance our individual rights and freedoms against the collective whole, and not only individuals, but on a global level as well. That's communitarianism. Its influence has already been seen in the last 2 decades in the political sphere. So how do we get this communitarian thinking implemented into the United States? Well, as you also may know, Clinton was elected president in November of 1992, and 6 months later, he issued Executive Order 12852, which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development, the PCSD. It first met in summer of 1993 and continued into 1999. The PCSD immediately began laying the groundwork for implementing Agenda 21 inside the United States. The goal was to change public policy to bring it in line with the new agenda for the 21st century. The PCSD formalized its recommendations in Sustainable America, a new consensus. The President's Council on Sustainable Development, the PCSD, gave a grant to the American Planning Association to design legislative guidebooks to be used as the blueprint in every city, county, and state in the United States in order to implement Agenda 21. This document, called the Growing Smart Legislative Guidebook, Model Statutes for Planning and Management of Change, took 7 years to complete and a full 9 years to arrive at this final version. It's called a guidebook, but really it's a blueprint that contains sample legislation, ordinances, rules, regulations, and statutes to be incorporated into the general plans of every city and county within the United States. By 2002, every planning department in every local, state, and federal department that governs land use had a copy and was implementing the practices, along with every university, college, junior college, private school, and teaching institution in our nation was using Growing Smart in its curriculum. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Well, it should, because Growing Smart is today's smart growth. For the last 10 years, there's been a planning revolution across the United States. It was the implementation of Agenda 21's Growing Smart under the idea of mixed usage. Redevelopment is a tool to further Agenda 21's vision of remaking America's cities with redevelopment. Economic collapses get engineered and they create a chain of events. The loss of funding means a loss of services to outlying areas, which means roads and utilities are not readily maintained in rural and suburban areas. Roads not being maintained means that schools are not being supported in those areas. Law enforcement, fire, and social services not being available in those areas. Eventually, department stores close, utility service, gas, and energy providers won't provide access due to, well, loss of roadway access, faulty or ill-maintained equipment, safety hazards, and so roads, supplies, and utilities become less and less and less available. Eventually, on and off-road ramps to those areas get closed due to quote-unquote safety concerns, cutting off entrances and exit options for vehicular traffic to and from those locations. The net result is a pro-con list of existing and future residents saying that the cons for living in such an area far outweigh the pros for living or even moving there. The net result is a gradual movement of that population out of those areas into a denser city center location. And to add to that list, we have engineered food shortages, supply chain disruptions, an increase in cost of gasoline coupled with higher cost of energy to heat and cool those larger, more distant homes from city centers, and you have more and more pressure to leave those areas. Cities cannot afford to extend their services outside their core areas. Slowly, people will not be able to afford single-family homes, afford private cars, and will become more and more dependent upon the state, thus more dependent upon the roundtable organizations. The idea is to apply the pressure that makes their lives as uncomfortable as possible. And they being oblivious to the fact that they're being systematically targeted, they think these are just naturally occurring events and they blame it on things like, well, the stock market or inflation or pandemics or Russians or North Koreans or whatever other nonsense they can think of, while behind the scenes they're being systematically manipulated at every turn or every step of the way. And then those manipulators step in and provide all the solutions that you're so desperately in need of, which is what they said that they would do from the beginning. The push is for you to get off the land and become more dependent, get out of the suburbs and into the cities, out of the private use of your homes and into condos, out of the private cars and onto your bikes. Bicycle advocacy groups are becoming very powerful now, are being used to help reshape and redevelop the cities for sustainable development. National groups such as the Complete Streets or Thunderhead Alliance have training programs teaching their members how to pressure for redevelopment. It's about remaking the cities and rural areas for sustainable development. High-density urban development without parking for cars is the actual goal. They call them transit villages. This means that the whole town needs to be demolished and rebuilt in the image of sustainable development under the ideology of communitarianism. Communitarianism is the idea of balancing the rights of the individual with the so-called rights of the community. So, how can you balance the rights of the individual with those of the community? The answer is simple. You don't, because that's stupid. And it reveals a false dichotomy. Why? Because the community is a non-entity. It has no rights under the Constitution. Individuals have rights and responsibilities that are inalienable, but the community, there is no such entity in existence. There is no such thing as the community as a whole, or the collective, or the global society. So the idea of balancing the rights of the individual against the rights of the community is it's a false dichotomy, a false choice, a false presupposition that should be called out for what it is. It's nonsense. The term community somehow gets the same rights and consideration as the individual is granted under the Constitution and makes a move from just being a term that refers to a group of right-bearing citizens to an entity itself, as if it can possess rights that an individual citizen is guaranteed under the Constitution. This sleight of hand magician's trick is a literary device used by the roundtable groups to trick unsuspecting citizens into thinking that there is a collective, a real entity known as the community that has rights, responsibilities that should be balanced against the rights of the individual. Now, we see the rhetoric of a global community under additional rhetoric of climate change. This is being pitched as the enlightened, politically correct position. If you disagree with it, or more literally, if you're familiar with the history and you know that it's just a ploy for world government, then you're labeled selfish if you insist that your individual rights and freedoms are to be protected. And this is the label that's placed on you by the UN Agenda 21. These dictators who run trusts, foundations, planning departments, city and town councils, think tanks, provinces and states, non-governmental foundations, secret societies have crafted rhetoric to make you think that you're selfish for standing up for your rights if you reject their power grab. And you're considered selfish because, according to them, you should accept this idea for the good of the planet, for everyone's safety, for your health, to protect your children, to limit workplace violence, to end poverty, to end bullying, to stop world hunger, to protect the rights of those in the future, to elevate the rights of women and young girls, to make more equitable, sustainable, and a prosperous world. To each of these we can say, nonsense. Because to feed the world, you have to control the world's food supplies. To end poverty, you have to control all the money. To stop bullying, you have to impose ideologies and enforcement mechanisms. To secure everyone, you have to control everyone. Part of the plan is to speak in coded language and deliberate vagary and elusive jargon designed to disguise the true motives and ambitions hidden behind buzzwords, vocabulary deliberately designed to keep people from being alarmed. Words like equity, equality, social justice, diversity, inclusiveness, stakeholders, consensus, progressive, smart, green, regional, sustainable, all buzzwords with empty slogans like build back better, we're all in this together, stay home, stay strong, apart but united, are used to manipulate you. When you hear jargon like this, you know that you're being conditioned to support and accept the project or the plan that they've attached to it without any questions asked. They are designer buzzwords and slogans created to help you feel as though you belong to the masses, that you're doing something positive and good, and that you'll gain acceptance by participating in them. It's a smokescreen, a movie prop, a mirage of water for parched lips, and the deserted, barren wasteland of empty promises inspired by the devil himself.